Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today we're going to talk about crazy parents. And I know that there's a way in which the term crazy parents, I've got crazy parents, can be humorous. It can be used as a dismissal of parental authority. It can be a way that we exaggerate to be funny when we're looking for commiseration with our friends. I think teenagers will often say, oh, my parents are crazy, as a way of diminishing their authority in service to the teenager's desire to be independent or to reinforce their own will, their own decisions. But dropping deeper down into the topic, what is it really like to have a truly mentally ill parent, a father, a mother, or both? What does that do to the psyche of the child and to the general field of the family? How do kids survive that or thrive in that environment, and what do they draw upon to be able to come out of that later in life in a way that perhaps has made them even stronger?
And I would add to the mentally ill category a parent who is alcoholic or who is otherwise addicted to not just a substance, but to something like gambling. But anything that in some substantive way really impairs a parent.
I'm thinking of like sort of mental illness and or serious dysfunction.
Yes.
Not sort of garden variety. All parents have failings, but then there's something else that we recognize as a little more serious that
is a truly impaired parent.
Yes.
So in this episode, some of the speakers, myself and Deb, are going to drop down into a little bit more personal experience and open up a little bit more. Mental illness was part of my family structure. My mother was tremendously unstable, and that had a powerful effect on our family, particularly late at night. In the middle of the night, I and the rest of my family could wind up, being pulled into an enormous frightening drama, which could come on like a flash flood and be over suddenly without explanation, leaving in its wake a tremendous amount of fear and anxiety and resentment, and deep down, a feeling that the world is just not safe, and not knowing why or what to do about it.
My mother also was tremendously unstable. She carried a diagnosis of bipolar disorder and was hospitalized at least twice, and I suspect a third time that was kind of covered up. After the birth of my brother, I believe she had postpartum depression. But I'm really resonating to what you've said, Joseph, about the instability of basic mood and the storms that could arise seemingly out of nowhere and be alarming, of this uncontained affect that was like a tsunami. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, these depressive phases for her, where she was really so listless and so unavailable, so not there, with such powerful sadness, that too evoked, a lot of feelings in me and my sister and my brother, and left, as you say, in its wake a feeling of deep insecurity, a lack of a solid, safe, secure place from which to engage the world, and made me pretty anxious about doing well and achieving and performing, but without that center in my solar plexus, so to speak, that enabled me to feel balanced and safe. I was insecure. And the process for me has been one of what they write about now as earned security, internal security. So it's quite a legacy, and it has its upside in a way if we can use it, if we can somehow make compost out of what this excess of stuff that we've inherited. It can yield certain dividends.
And it's probably no mistake that we're all in mental health
Yes.
treatment fields.
Oh, gosh, go figure. We teach what we need to learn, right?
And what's the underlying fantasy of finding a way to be in relationship to madness in a way that is compassionate and could facilitate transformation and healing? You know, what part of that comes from the deepest child's wish to heal the parent?
Yeah, I remember, I think it was James Hollis one time saying, you know, that there are many people who become therapists for the wrong reasons, you know, and that they shouldn't be in the field because they're doing it out of a desire to, you know, an unconscious desire to sort of heal a parent or gain control of a chaotic situation, but that it is depleting for them to do the work. You know, I've thought about that a lot. I think you can come into the field with the background of early childhood trauma, and that can indeed make you more resilient, more compassionate, having easier access to your intuition about these things. And it can be quite enlivening. And for some people, it can be quite depleting. And I don't really know what that difference is.
I think it has very much to do with how the training process of the provider has allowed for personal transformation. For instance, all of us, and listeners may not know, but in order to complete any form of a psychoanalytic program, whether it's Jungian or Freudian or Lacanian, that the training candidate has to undergo years of intensive analysis of their own material as part of the training process. So I might imagine that Hollis was saying is that when the perhaps uninitiated or naive therapist comes out of an academic training program, maybe an MSW or an LPC program that has no requirement for personal psychotherapy, they can wind up walking into situations with their childhood wounds open and raw and running.
Yeah, and
that's going to do something different.
The fantasy is very unconscious at that point, right? I'm going to heal people, and it's going to sort of compensate for these childhood wounds rather than it having been cooked and digested and lifted up to a more conscious place.
Absolutely. So I think that the particular training that we underwent prepared us differently than perhaps other therapists to sit in the fire of a client whose parent is mentally ill, for whom that wound is hot and bleeding, and for us not to get swamped by that, hopefully, but be able to relate to it.
It takes a really strong ego, for one thing. I mean, that's just for one thing. Yes.
No, I'm thinking that one of the things that happened, it seems for you, Joseph, and I know it happened for me, was that there was external world validation for my mother with her bipolar diagnosis. So the problem was not swept under the rug. It had a name. It was identified.
And you knew it wasn't you.
And I knew that it wasn't me. And I think that one of the things we do with our own clients in therapy is sometimes to provide the validation and the space for that person to say, you know, my mother, my aunt, my grandfather, and tell the story that may not have been validated. It may not have been acknowledged that, yes, this was what was. This did happen. This was your experience.
So I have a thought about this that's sort of just been cooking in my mind for some time, because I have worked with some people that I think would fit into the category. I think they call these people, of which you two are examples, also super survivors. People that had real childhood trauma and had not just survived, but really thrived.
And I would say that it wasn't just being in training and the analysis that we've all had during training, but it started way long before that with my own desire to recognize my own woundedness and heal myself, understand myself, come to terms with it, to move forward myself. And that's often, what, of course, that's what we do with and for the clients that come to us is what resides now in you.
So when scientists have looked at what's the difference between the kid who had the borderline mother who is not functioning well as an adult versus the one who is, and one of the factors that they discovered is this, and this is sort of empirical research, is this concept called a locus of control.
Yes.
So what they found is that those kids who had an internal locus of control, like, and that would sort of translate like, this situation is nuts, and it's up to me to try to figure out to get a paper route, or figure out how I can get out of the house, or get myself to college. That those are the ones that do really well. And Deb, going back to your point, that you knew that you had this external validation that there was something wrong with your mother. I think it's very normal. I think most children, when something happens to a parent, it's an automatic place to go to, it's my fault. So when a child's parent dies, the child often thinks somehow I did this. Or the parent gets divorced and the child thinks I did this. And if your parent is acting crazy, you as a child, it would be a very natural thing to think somehow this must be my fault. It must be because I'm a bad kid. If somehow that child is able to develop the thought, this isn't me, this is not okay, my parent's ill, I think that helps create an internal locus of control, that this isn't me and there's something I can do, even though I'm 9. There's something I can do to start to get out of here, for example. Maybe it's, I've got so many more years. How can I get out faster or whatever?
I think that happens much later in childhood, perhaps in teenage years. But I would say that not really until one is maybe even in high school do you have a sense that there's a horizon that's not going to involve your parents. I think prior to that, let's say in middle school or even elementary school, there is a sense that this is the unmoving fate, and that whatever survival instincts that I had to rely on something much more primal in myself. Whether it was realizing that I had to be out in the small forest behind our home as often as possible, that I couldn't divulge any personal struggles because that would be too provocative to the parent. And it was like a woodland creature to find a way to stay away from a predator and to avoid. So the
it was
feeling
just about survival
in that most core kind of way. The other thing I want to bring up in terms of resilience is I did have an instinct for positive mothering in other people. And once I became the neighborhood paper boy, I had this very clear instinct to forge alliances with the moms in the neighborhood who were very supportive, most of them not knowing why I was taking such an interest in them, but clearly instinctively trying to cultivate a warmth. And so
sort of finding it where you could.
Yes. But thinking back to it, it's feeling how the self inside of me inquired, really stepped into a relationship with some of the moms in the neighborhood who were open to that. And so I had invitations for dinner and, women who were asking me, how are you doing? What's going on? And there is some statistical research about resilience.
Yes.
And if a child in a terrible circumstance has at least one adult outside of the circumstance who really takes an interest in the kid, that the resilience of the child
Yes.
expands exponentially. So that was a kind of grace that just landed.
Or came from the self, as you said, that you had an instinct to do that.
Yeah, I'm remembering. So you're talking about escaping. You escaped into the woods. I escaped into books. So that's one strategy, a sort of primal early strategy, is to somehow build a barrier between self and the negative impact and the feelings of unsafety in the home. And the other is finding external world resources. And I had an aunt, one aunt in particular that I was very close to, and whose house I could stop off at after school, and that's what I did. But to seek out well springs of nurturance, support, interest, safety, is another sort of early on primal strategy. And both of those can be imported into adulthood. Where are the places that nurture you? Where's the good stuff? How can I get it?
Yeah, where is the good mother in the world? And for the unconscious to guide us, to be able to recognize it archetypally, even if it wasn't demonstrated terribly much in the home.
And that's, that's one of the important things about the concept of the archetype, is that the potential for the good mother is inborn in each of us. It's sort of patterned before experience. That's the nature of the archetype. So even if we don't have it in the actual outer mother, there's a part of us that knows that and can reach for it and look for it.
And knows it, and for me the word would be recognizes it. Because I think that it requires encountering it in a relationship to really know it, rather than for it to be somewhere else. So to recognize, let's say, a neighbor who looks at me with a particular kind of intuitive compassion, can see this is a kid's in trouble, and to respond with an open heart really incarnates the good mother and mediates it in the face of this lovely neighbor. And through that, the feelings are able to incarnate, and the medicine of that.
We get seen. And I think it's axiomatic to therapy, but relatives and neighbors can be therapeutic as well as psychotherapists sitting in offices. To be seen, to be understood, to be mirrored, that we have to see ourselves first through the eyes, in the reflection of the eyes of another. First, we have to find it in another human being before we can find it in ourselves. And it may be a teacher, it may be all kinds of people.
It's about relationship.
It's all about relationship.
But
we have to have a relationship with an other or several others before we can really have that relationship with ourselves that builds a more secure inner sense of self, more secure foundation.
Let me ask you a question, though, because what do you think about someone who kind of constellates the good mother through only something like nature or books? What do you think about that?
I think I've seen that. I think I've seen that
I have too.
in my practice. So the difficulty, and I like very much like Donald Kalshad's work in The Inner World of Trauma, where he says that when there is a developmental wound, for instance, having a dangerous parent, which I survived, there's a way in which there's a hole in the psyche, HOLE, a missing part, but something about the self, something about the instinct as well, demands that hole be meshed, be held. And what sweeps into the hole is an archetypal compensation. So when the archetypal mother becomes the only thing that sweeps into the psyche to take a stand, then the archetypal mother can be projected into any number of what we might imagine is rather abstract kind of places where it gets held. So if it's projected into the forest, and a young man or a young woman only experiences any feeling of the mother in the forest, that is the energy of the mother mediated only by the trees and the canopy and the wildness of the forest. And there's so many other dimensions of the mother that they might require or might need to know about to parent a child one day, that has to be addressed somehow in the therapy, the evolution of the image of the mother.
It can sort of be a place to start.
But it is a place to start.
It's a place to start. It goes to the archetypal realm, and the archetypal realm needs to be humanized. It needs to be brought into the human realm. For me, the fairy tales that I read by the bucketful and other books were in the archetypal realm also. We know the fairy tales are embodying archetypal themes. They're images of archetypal realities. So how does it get humanized? And just what you said before, Lisa, it gets humanized in relationship, in human relationship. And that is, ideally the process of parenting, is that all these instincts and huge, tremendous affects in a baby or a toddler having a meltdown get humanized by the parent, we hope, and moderated and supported. So we can find it elsewhere or later in life, hopefully.
And there's a phenomena inside the psyche that compels that. For instance, I remember in second grade, I had this tremendously warm and loving second grade teacher, Mrs. Salminen. And there was a way in which I just fell in love with her. And thank God she had the wisdom and the depth to actually allow that, to kind of welcome it. And I would go back and visit her. So then when I was in third grade, I would make sure that I saved time during the lunch period to go and visit Mrs. Salminen. And then in fourth grade to go and visit her again. And then in fifth grade to ask if she needed anything, to be a helper in the room. But it was all about just basking in this warmth, which of course was very appropriate. It wasn't as if she was giving me hugs, but there was this feeling tone. And interestingly enough, both of my sisters recognize that in her as well. Like all three of us can think about Mrs. Salminen and go, oh.
She probably knew.
She sensed something. But again, the mother, the energy of the mother in her could rise up in that archetypal way that was not explicit.
I think what we're saying is that the mother archetype and relational resources are available from a lot of sources, whether it's nature or books or a teacher or a neighbor or a therapist or not to mention friends. That it doesn't have to happen only from your actual parent. It is
or a grandmother, perhaps.
Or a grandmother, absolutely. And I think that's hopeful, is it's available, it's out there, and the psyche, the self, seeks it. We have a resonance for it. We want it. You sought it out in your teacher and later on in neighbors, and I did too.
So I want to go back to something you said, Joseph, about how both of you referenced it, that there could be sort of, I don't know what we want to call it, something like hidden benefits. I mean, I hate to say that because growing up with a parent like this is just so horrific to insinuate that it might confer some good things is sort of a difficult thing to move around. But I know there is research to that. If you Google it, you get article titles, something like, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger?" ?
The hardest steel goes through the hottest fire.
Yeah, yes.
If life hands you lemons.
And I do see this. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons I want to bring it up is, sort of sitting in a consulting room decade after decade, you see some people who sort of function really well in spite of tremendous hardship. And some of the people who don't function so great, didn't necessarily go through anything. I mean, it's sort of like, well, what's worse? But if you allow me that, it doesn't necessarily stand that going through something really horrendous as a child is going to mean that you're incapacitated as an adult.
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to emphasize here, is that there is a trajectory, there is a road ahead. There are resources available from the external world and in your own internal world. And I think that, in a way, if we can find some way to use the experiences and the feelings that we had as children and teens and young adults, it can make us more resonant to our clients and to other people. We can develop terrifically good radar.
I think there's the radar. I think there's also, I notice in myself and others who I've worked with who came out of scorching childhoods, is a capacity to stay integrated in the midst of chaos, having developed that muscle as a child.
Yes.
Which I noticed very much when I did my first round of professional work in an inpatient psychiatric unit. And because I was one of the few male social workers, they placed me for reasons of safety, they thought, on the most disordered unit, where kind of wildly, psychotic patients would be in, or tremendously violent patients. And I had the confidence to have an open door policy on the unit, and that it worked. That I just left my door open all the time, that the patients would kind of float into the room, they'd kind of sit down, often calm down. We'd have what we could as a conversation, and they'd kind of float off. And that would happen kind of on and off, during the day. And I think their feeling of safety in doing that was related to my feeling of familiarity and ability to stay intact and safe. Because I have to say, the kind of stuff I saw in the unit was nothing compared to the kind of stuff I saw growing up. So it was small. It was small stuff by comparison. So unlike perhaps people who'd never encountered that, I was very comfortable. And I think I'm going to say something very provocative, but that because I was and am comfortable with madness, that my clients, or many of them, feel more comfortable bringing that forward in themselves, whether the unconscious makes it manifest more frequently in my office, kind of introducing whatever their version of madness is fairly quickly in the room, and my ability to be curious and friendly to that and not threatened by it. And I attribute that very much to my childhood.
Yes, I see that in you too.
So I'm thinking that from a Jungian perspective, in a kind of broad brush way, what we got was very early and often far too intense experiences of shadow. We got it. We know a lot of these kinds of dark places, and they evoked dark places in us as well. But that's part of the healing process too. When we work with clients, is where is your shadow? What is unacknowledged? What are these dark places in your psyche? And it wasn't such a surprise to find those in myself, having kind of grown up with that. That is where healing comes from, is the shadow. And to be able to say, let's go there, you and I. Let's go there, because it's also the wellspring of creativity and healing and richness, inner richness. I don't know that you experienced it as much in a way as I did, because my mother, I have to say, was also valiant, passionate, funny, loving. She was an artist. So I had that other side as well of her passion for life, as well as these incredibly dark places that she could go, sometimes frightening places. But there is value in shadow, even if it is your own childhood trauma. And the other thing I'm going to say, it was mentioned before, but I want to underscore it, is Donald Kalshed's book was incredibly important to me, and it has been important to clients and to many other people. So it's Kalsched, and it's called The Inner World of Trauma.
Why don't we pop a link into the show notes for people that want to look at that book?
Great idea. Let's do that.
Following up on that, Jung says in volume 5 somewhere, he says this thing that I think is so important. He says something like, I'm paraphrasing, the worst thing that could happen to a man is to be successful. Because if you're always successful, you're never thrown back on the unconscious and made to recognize your dependence on it. And I think that that's another thing that happens in a situation like this is that you can't depend on the outer world. So you find yourself thrown into the inner world and you discover that there's something there. Mm-hmm. That's right in Kalshed's book as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I read, I was a neophyte therapist, and I had many, many clients in a community mental health setting who had trauma in their childhoods and adulthoods. And I remembered reading all kinds of books about trauma, trying to understand it. And it was Donald Kalshed's book that really resonated and made sense to me. So there's another resource that's out there, as well as the world and nature and therapy and friends and life itself.
So what if someone's listening who grew up with a crazy parent, mm-hmm. who maybe is really struggling? What would we say to that person?
I mean, where my mind goes, if there was some interaction with them, is I'd want to know the categories in which they're struggling, because that would really shape how I would respond. There are so many different categories of severity, impact upon them and impact upon others. So when we're looking at a clinical diagnosis, let's say, when you open up the DSM, they'll have a list of symptoms that people might be suffering. But at the bottom, there's always that phrase that it has to be severe enough to cause significant impairment in their life and in their functioning. So I think there's a category of suffering which has to do with just quality of life. That, the job is good, we've got kids, I'm partnered, lots of resources, but internally there's this chronic sense of not feeling met, or I've never really landed in the world, or I'm just chronically unhappy.
And anxious.
And that's that's a place sometimes where we will have to face that there is a residue from the traumatic childhood that just hasn't been resolved just through attaining kind of a worldly competence or success. And then there's another category of phenomena around childhood trauma is where people are still in the trauma field in a hot and sometimes even wild way. And that person, I think, really needs to seek out help. And support.
Say more about what you mean by being in the trauma field. What are you meaning by that?
Sure. A client who was able to get an adequate education, can present well at a job interview, but then as they find themselves in a working environment and demands are placed upon them, they find themselves not able to regulate their emotions, perhaps blurting out things that should better have been kept private, perhaps even acting in ways that are too intense with coworkers because they're under stress.
It's really affecting their life.
Yeah, and they can't maintain the job, and they wind up not being able to build a series of successes in a way that's just very concrete and worldly. In that way, we can imagine that the storm is just so ephemerally, so ineffectively held inside of them that the least amount of stress can set them, internally on fire. The same thing with dating. Some people that are still dealing with a tumult in the soul find that the intimacy of dating provokes too much of the unresolved childhood issues, and they have a hard time either maintaining a reasonably healthy relationship, or are drawn to other partners who are equally as provocative, and there's this kind of almost frightening
conflagration
that passes for a relationship, but actually is a reproduction of the childhood family dynamics in its scariest way.
Yeah.
So those clients do come into the office and often are mystified that they're not necessarily tethering it back to family patterns or early experiences. So Working with a wounded client in that way is often gentle, it's slow, it has to do with creating a lot of safety in the environment, and also allowing the intellect to be the helpful companion of the process, to convince somebody and to help them know you can think through this.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like that image of the intellect as the companion. There's the sense that, well, insight alone doesn't heal. Well, no, it doesn't. But if there's a surfeit of emotion, including the intellect in it and the thinking function, pairing the feeling with an understanding of what's happening can help sort of dry it out a little bit.
Yes, and it gives you 2 points of view.
Yeah, it does.
You're having your feelings.
Yes.
And
I
you
love
can
that, Deb.
also observe your feelings. I often use the image of it's like a sports arena, and part of you is on the field in the scrum, and part of you has a view from the skybox as if from above. And those 2 places can talk to one another. It's thinking about it, recognizing it intellectually is a good start. It develops a binocular vision, as it were.
That's perfect.
And I think the early psychoanalysts called it mentalizing, which is just the ability to say, well, what do you think about this? And then often the analyst would say, okay, and what's another way to think about it? Just to exercise that muscle that we can walk around something and the mind can help us.
And then you can have a relationship with it rather than just being in it.
Exactly.
Yes. And that may sound very small to some listeners, but for people who are caught in an excruciating storm of feeling and sensations, that's a big move.
Oh, it's huge.
To be able to think through perspectives, particularly in the face of a storm of feelings.
It takes both of those positions of the feelings and the being able to observe, and we call it an observing ego. When you have that, it's gigantic, and then you can have a relationship to it. Then you can be curious of like, I wonder why when this happens, these feelings come up and I tend to go into these kinds of behaviors. You're able to observe that and go back through it and process it differently. I also think, in answer to your question about what do you do with all this if there's early trauma, in this podcast, I think what we're saying between the lines is there's a path for you. There's a road to go down. There's good stuff to be had. There's healing. There's awareness. Reach out for it in all kinds of ways, whether it's in therapy or a support group or friendships or a book like Donald Kalshed's. Don't be disheartened by it. In a way, we're companioning you going down this road. We and many, 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 many others follow the path. There's a forward trajectory. There's a telos, a forward purpose and life ahead for you.
That sounds like a gentle place to pause the conversation and to take a look at a dream.
Okay, well, a listener sent in a dream, and the dreamer is a 22-year-old male who is a university student. And here's the dream. My bandmate and I are in an underground burial chamber which was dimly lit by torches. At some point, we come across a large tomb or coffin. The coffin was black and was decorated with golden stick figure men with very large erect penises. They looked a lot like prehistoric cave drawings of people. There was a smaller coffin inserted into the top of the larger, which could be removed and slid back. My bandmate removes the smaller coffin and opens the lid. Inside is the rotting, decaying body of an infant girl. It's at this point in the dream I remember feeling particularly unsettled. At that point, both of us knew we were supposed to be the two wheeling this coffin out of wherever we were. We were supposed to be the funerary procession. And I asked for the context of the dream, and the dreamer said, well, there's not much. I have 1 year of school left, and I turned 22 a month before the dream. And I asked, what are the main feelings in the dream? And he reported reservation, somewhat disturbed, ritualistic. And I think that's it.
So I'm struck just thematically with the idea of excavating, of a kind of archaeologic excavation, going deeper down, finding something surprising, something that had been structured, perhaps by an ancient part of his own psyche, and having the life force and the drive to lift up a piece of this buried material and to want to bring it to the surface, which I think is an apt metaphor for depth work that we do as Jungian analysts when the client is ready. And if a client brought a dream like this, as their analyst, I might say, wow, this person is ready to do some deep excavations, and they're in fact beginning that process.
Yeah, I mean, this dream, my initial reaction to this dream was, wow. But sort of taking it from the top, as it were. He is with his bandmate, and of course we don't know anything about this bandmate, but that would be one of the first questions I would ask is, tell me about the bandmate. I have a suspicion about this bandmate, but Deb, you looked like you were going to say something.
I too am very curious about the bandmate as a descriptor and a relationship, a type of relationship. So I have a fantasy about that. But overall, my first reaction to this dream is that I want to cry. The excavation and the sadness of the body of this little girl that is rotting and decaying, and then that we have to wheel the coffin out and be the funerary procession, that the death of this child is to be mourned.
Finally.
Exactly. Something has died here.
She's been dead for a while.
There's an incredible sort of psychic sadness of, what has died. And I think of the bandmate is another male, is my fantasy here. And that this is so very masculine and sort of macho of the excavation, the tomb.
Well, no, there isn't an excavation.
No, you're right.
We are in an underground burial chamber.
But here this coffin is black and decorated with stick figure men with very large erect penises. So there seems to be such a lot of the macho, quintessentially male.
Well, sort of phallic, masculine energy.
Exactly. And then there is the feminine, the anima figure, the inner feminine, who is small, who is young, and who has died.
And when we frame it that way, I think and remember my own life as a 22-year-old male, where the erection and the phallic and the sexual tension is so high, is so demanding, and underneath that, is there an inanimate, undeveloped feminine soul? And what happens? What is the timing when that becomes acknowledged? And it seems perhaps at 22, we don't know what other experiences might have brought it forward, but the inanimate feminine in the midst of all of that phallic erect force is got the attention of the psyche. Now, one of the things that we often wonder about as analysts is whether or not something can really die in the realm of the psyche, or whether it is an issue of being unanimated with the potential to be reanimated. And there were different ideas among the early founding analysts. I think von Franz had a strong feeling that things really could die, and perhaps even should die from time to time in the unconscious. Other analysts thought, no, that death is purely symbolic, and that reanimation in one form or another was inevitable.
It's that sort of conservation of energy concept, right? That it can take another form, but it doesn't just disappear.
The paradox here is that this infant girl is decaying, dead, rotting, and yet also is very much alive in the awareness of the dream ego and the bandmate and the dreamer himself. So there is a feminine presence that is very powerful, even though it's imaged as having died.
And the putrefactio of the alchemists.
Yes.
Say more about that.
So Jung was very interested later on in his life with the images, the art, and the writing of the medieval alchemists, which is very poetic and very evocative and very mysterious and very creative. Mm-hmm. So one way of thinking about it is the alchemists were the early chemists, and they were experimenting with substances and heat and pressure and various kinds of containers, and were amazed by the fact that you could crush a piece of ore, boil it in a vat of mercury, boil the mercury until it steams off, and then the crucible that it's in would be coated with liquid gold. And because there was no scientific theory or language of chemical interactions, that it was up to the alchemists to express their ideas of why or how this happened. And they often drew upon religious images and even dream images, ancient philosophies, to create a kind of mythology of why this would occur. But they did notice, or did feel, that they identified several stages that seemed to be linked together in this chemical transformations. One of them was the idea of rotting, which of course was something that was observed in the natural world. And in the putrefaction, or the rotting of things, even just in the natural community, there was some relationship between the rotting of something, the rotting of leaves, for instance, or the rotting of a dead animal, that seemed to be fertile, that seemed to fertilize the land.
That this is a necessary stage in transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I noticed about the dream is that, as you pointed out so beautifully, Deb, this dream is filled with, saturated with imagery full of feeling. Mm-hmm. And yet the dreamer does not say much. What are the main feelings in the dream? And he says, reservation, somewhat disturbed. He talked before about feeling unsettled. And it strikes me that in that sense, that's very much sort of kind of showing what the dream is actually about, that the ability to relate to emotions, which is often categorized along with those qualities that are considered the feminine, are not well developed, perhaps, in this dreamer's psyche. They've been going through a decaying process, and now it's time maybe to mourn them and bring them to light.
And the mourning is full of feeling. Yes. A funeral is very sad.
There's a lot of feeling in the unconscious the dreamer may not consciously be related to yet.
Yeah. So I'm kind of back to what you lifted up a little while ago of what is a bandmate. This is very specific, and that is the situation as it is. My bandmate and I are in an underground chamber. Okay. He doesn't say a friend. He doesn't say his roommate. It's a bandmate. And my fantasy about that is that it's another male. Mm-hmm. And what do band members do? They play together. Mm-hmm. There's a performance aspect, a rehearsal aspect, a competence aspect of learning the music and practicing. But it's very active. Mm-hmm. And yet, what are you playing? You're playing music, mm-hmm. which has feeling in it. Mm-hmm. It's evocative. So it's an interesting relationship, I think, a hint perhaps at a relationship with feeling that exists in a band and with music, and is now being moved to the grieving process for this infant girl.
So I also have a fantasy about the bandmate. I agree with everything you said, but I have I make up a story, I'm just making it up, that if I were to be able to ask the streamer about the qualities because I'm assuming this is a particular person, mm-hmm. right? Not just some generic bandmate. Qualities of this particular bandmate. What we would find is that this bandmate might be sort of a shadow figure. This is a little bit maybe like a doppelganger, sort of a twin. And perhaps this bandmate has access to some of the feeling that the dreamer is just becoming to get into relationship with. That would be what I would suspect.
Yes. And I want to say a word about what you just did when you said, I imagine that, and how useful that is in the analytic process, is that we imagine things. We let our fantasies take place as we relate right now to this particular dream. We don't know that it's true. We're not pronouncing that it's true. But what if? Or maybe this? Or could it be that?
Yeah, it's actually a playful space, isn't
Yes.
it? And it's important to find that in the analytic hour.
I want to lift it to another archetypal piece, that when I think of one realm of male initiation, it could happen through the myth or the lens of Dionysus. And when I think of bandmates and the kind of exuberance and expressiveness being in a band could have, in the initiation for Dionysus, that in Dionysus's, in the myth, Dionysus is cursed by Hera, and he goes into a state of madness. And because he's a powerful god, there is great carnage that is visited upon the world. And finally, his grandmother Rhea draws him into her mystery tradition, which are the mysteries, the Eletian mysteries, which are the mysteries of initiation into the cult of the feminine. And apparently, although we don't know a lot about it, that it would occur in caves, that it was somehow a mystery of death and rebirth. It had something to do with sexual forces. And that when Dionysus emerged from that, he had regained his balance and his sanity and his authority to be the person he was and to reign as a god equal with the others in Olympus. So when I imagine him going down to the underworld with a companion, and often there would be a psychopomp, whether it was Hermes or any number of other gods that would go with you to the underworld so that you wouldn't get lost and you could navigate the darkness. And then again, to find this wonderful juxtaposition between the life-giving, inseminating phallus and the death of the young girl, the putrefying of the young girl, all of that leading into a process of rebirth on a whole new arc.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that you bring up. Most of the, I was thinking of the Eleusinian mysteries as well, and most of the initiations into the mysteries of the feminine do involve going down into the underworld.
Yes.
Down into, and Jung had an early childhood dream about, I believe it was in an underground space where he saw the giant phallus.
Oh, yes.
So there's something about this sacred masculine force in the midst of the feminine womb-like earth.
And the confrontation with death. This was an old tradition that's only intermittently continued, but in Freemasonic initiation, that before the initiate or the candidate is brought into the main temple to receive the initiation, they are placed in a chamber of reflection. And the chamber of reflection has any number of different symbolic objects in it, but one of the things is there is a coffin and there is a realistic skeleton in the coffin that they are expected to meditate upon. This also is done in some Buddhist traditions. They call it the meditation on the corpse, where the young monks will be brought to a courtyard. A recently deceased member of the village will be left in the courtyard, and over a 30-day period, the monks will simply meditate on the phenomena of decay of the corpse. And this is meant to affect a certain kind of psychological change of attitude. The temporality of life has to be accepted and the reality of death. And at 22 years old, that's a big initiation. And I wonder what might have constellated that.
Well,
for him.
it seems perhaps not unimportant that he's finishing university, so he's getting ready to go out into life.
Yes.
You know, one more thought about the emotional tone of the dream. When I was reading it, I was thinking, well, this is a numinous dream. And numinous is this word that Jung picked up and used that means something like the awe that one feels, sort of overwhelming awe, and specifically associated with what one might feel in the presence of God, say. And for me, that certainly had that tone. Now, for the dreamer, the only thing we hear is that we became unsettled. I mean, one certainly becomes unsettled when one is in the presence of a divine mystery, but perhaps that's kind of an understatement.
It's also a very common masculine attitude of not allowing oneself to get flustered or not demonstrating being overly disturbed by things.
Yes, a sort of stiff upper lip.
Cool and collected and in charge kind of masculinity.
So I think that may be a good place to leave it. As always, we are grateful to the dreamer who has sent in a dream.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.